What's up everyone, and today we're going to talk about the context package in Go. Now this is one of my favorite packages in Go standard library. It's elegant, it's powerful, it's well written and documented, much like most of the Go standard library code. So here's what we're going to do in this video. We'll discuss where the contexts are useful, and then we'll look into the context package code and see how it has to be implemented, and then we'll go over some examples and see how to use it in your code. Okay. So what is the use of this context package? Say for example, you have a guest over and he wants to eat pizza. So you are implicitly given the task to make the pizza for them. You tell your younger brother, go buy some veggies and cheese and other items that we need to make the pizza. So then you can actually make it. That person goes to the market to get this stuff, and meanwhile the guest changes its mind saying he does not want the pizza now. But your brother has already gone to purchase it. Now you need to call him and tell him to drop whatever he is buying and come back because you don't need the items anymore. So context package allows this type of cancellation signals to be sent between the two programs or routines, whatever. Another use could be setting deadlines for tasks. For example, you as a teenager are all too busy hanging out with your friends day and night, and your parents are frustrated, and then they tell you that if you decide to come home after 9 p.m., don't bother coming at all. Or if you decide to come home after 2 hours, don't come. So, context package can be used in these types of situations where you need to set deadlines and timeouts. Another use could be sending values across the request. So it's as simple as it sounds. You just send values along with the context itself. We'll talk about this in more detail during the demo. So on the screen you can see 6 different types of contexts. And before talking about these contexts, let's look at how the context package actually works. So context package works in a graph-based approach. So you will have your root context, which in most of the situations will be context.background. Then after that, whatever context you make will actually be the child of the root context. So if I do context.with cancel, it will actually take the parent context, which is in this case context.background, and it will generate a new context with context.background as the parent context. Similarly, you can create any other context from the previous context as the parent. So this sort of makes a graph. It helps us because if the parent context is cancelled, then cancellation is actually propagated across all its children and all the children of its children. Now this is very useful in complex concurrent execution scenarios. Okay, so now that we have an idea of how the context package works, let's see the ways in which we can create the context and go about with it. So number one would be context.background. So context.background and to do are both empty contexts. Among these two, context.background will be something you will be using to create the root context, and then context.todo is just a placeholder which you can use whenever you don't know which context to be used. So you can just pass it as a placeholder. Next are context.with timeout, with deadline, cancel, and value. So these 4 contexts actually are derived context. So you pass in the parent context and then it will give you the new context, which will be the child of parent context. So when you're dealing with some sort of cancellation signals, you would use context.with cancel. This function will actually take the parent context and then return a new context and a cancel function. So that cancel function we can use to send cancellation signals. If you want to carry deadlines across XHR requests and Go routines, then you would probably go with timeout and with deadline. And if you want to send some request scope values across API boundaries, then you would probably use with value. So a good example would be sending request IDs, attaching the request IDs with the context. We'll look into it more in our demo. So now let's look at the context package. So the package exposes your interface context and it has 4 functions in it. So the number 1 function is the deadline function. So deadline function tells us when the context will be cancelled, and if there is no cancellation in the context, then it will return okay is equal to false. The next function is the done function. So the done function returns channel that's closed when your program has ended execution because a context has been cancelled. I'll repeat it again. So whenever we send some cancellation signals, either you send it or in case of timeout and deadlines, the code itself sends it. So whenever cancel function is being called, then the channel which calls the cancellation function is sent to that done channel. So you would essentially be able to catch when a particular context has been cancelled, and then do anything that you want to do. Next is the error function. So as the name suggests, it just returns the error. Next is the value function. So value function actually returns the value associated with a particular key in case you are sending values across, just like you would send it with value. So I'm back here on my editor and I have one main.go file ready. So we'll check out one example quickly. So let's start by making a root context, which will be context.background. So this is our root context, and we'll make context dot with cancel. So we'll look at how to send cancellation signals here. So it just takes a parent context, which will be ctx, and then it returns a new context and a cancel function, which we are supposed to cancel. So we'll make a time.after func. So I'll just say after maybe I'm sorry, after 2 seconds, run this function. So this function, what it does is just prints simple hello. But I also start a go routine here, and in this go routine I specify okay, time dot sleep, just sleep for 1 second, and after 1 second just cancel this context. So what's happening is this piece of code will actually print after 2 seconds, print hello after 2 seconds, but before we give a chance for this function to print hello, we actually are cancelling the context itself. So let's run this program and see what happens. Okay, we'll do go run main.go and nothing happens. It does not print hello. So what happened really? We actually did not catch the cancel context. So if you remember, we talked about a done function in context. So this actually is giving us a ctx of type context, right? And this context interface has actually a done function assigned to it. So let's catch that context cancellation now. So I'll just remove this code and we'll do a select statement. And in case I'll, instead of using time.after func, I'll just do time.after here. And I'll say 2 into time.second, and after 2 seconds just print hello. And I'll do another case here, which I'll receive context.done. That means the context has been cancelled. So I'll just do log dot fatal if, and I'll do ctx dot error. Okay, now let's see what happens here. So I'll do run again, and if you see, it actually prints context cancel. So this is the error that we printed. So now we're able to catch that the context has been cancelled. So this is all about propagation of the context cancellation. So maybe you run the program, and as soon as you press a key, then you want to exit that. So that also can be achieved through the same logic here. Instead of just time.sleep, you can provide any operation, you can read the keystroke, and then you can cancel the context. Okay, so now that we have understood how with cancel works, let's try to understand how with timeout and with deadline works. With timeout and with deadline are pretty similar, so we'll see what is the difference when we actually jump into the code. So I'll make a folder, I'll just name it cancel, and I'll put the main.go there. I'll make another folder, okay, outside, make another folder, maybe timeout, and then create a new file, main.go, define the package main, func main, as always, and as always we'll again make the parent context, which will be background context, and we'll make another context with timeout, which will be context comma cancel. So it will return context and a cancel func, and it will be context dot with timeout. It will take the parent context and it will take the timeout. So for now we'll set the timeout as 2 seconds. Another thing that we need to do is we have to use this cancel func to cancel it. So it will allocate some memory spaces when we call this function. So it's always a good idea to call the cancel func, and it will deallocate those memory spaces actually. So Okay, now that we have done this, let's simulate a timeout condition. So for that, I'll use a select statement again, and I'll say my actual response, whatever function that I'm running, will take around 3 seconds. So we'll say time dot after 3 seconds. So after 3 seconds, I need to print hello. Come on. Okay, but as you can see, we are timing out after 2 seconds only, so we need to catch that timeout also. So for that, we'll use context.done as always. So we'll just do log.println. We'll print context.error dot error. So this will print error. And now okay, so I'm in this timeout directory. Oops, what's happening? And timeout. Okay, so now I'm in this timeout directory. I'll do go run main.go. So what is happening here is we are timing out after 2 seconds, but our function is actually taking 3 seconds to respond. So if we run this, I should get a timeout. It should get timed out. So yes, it does the get timed out, and it says context deadline exceeded. That is true. That is what we want. So this is how you would actually want to use with timeout. So when it comes to with deadline, it is same as with timeout. So if you look at this with timeout function, it actually calls with deadline function internally. So you are really calling with deadline always, even if you call with timeout. So all we would need to do is actually use with deadline here, and then instead of time.second, like after 2 seconds, I'll just say 2 seconds from now. So that will be time.now dot add 2 seconds. So it will add 2 seconds to the current time, and this will be the deadline. And if we are right, then it should run the same as expected, and it should time out after 2 seconds, and it surely does. So with timeout and with deadline, almost the same. So if we now actually do 3 seconds here and then uh, print hello in 2 seconds, then it should print hello successfully, because now it's not getting timed out. Yeah, it did print hello. So this is the basics of how to actually use with cancel, with deadline, and with timeout. We'll look at with value later when we actually look at API request, because that will be easier to explain. Okay, so now let's look at how you would send a context across API request, and then how you would time out that API request, or how you would send value across through context. So let's make another folder here. I'll make a server, and let's make main.go again, and package main, the same boilerplate, and let's use log.panic. We just panic if http dot listen answer, and we'll give the address. We'll say 127.0.0.1, and we'll use the port 3000 and nil. Okay, so our HTTP server will listen on port 3000, and now let's make a handle. So http dot handle func, and it will take path, so it will be our root, and then we'll just call handler. So we'll make a handler here, func. Oops. So we'll make a handler func handle. It will receive http dot response writer, and pointer to http dot request. Okay, let's just do fmt dot fprintln, and we'll send hello. So we'll pass w here, and then we'll send hello. Okay, handler, sorry. So we'll go to server, and if I do go run main.go, it will run the server, and let's curl http localhost 3000. So it should give us hello back from the server. Okay, so now that we have the server, let's make a client. So we'll make a client. The file would be main.go again. And I'll just use this. Don't want to use this again and again. So I want to type it again and again. So we'll just use this. Okay. So we'll do http.get simple get request to http colon localhost 3000. http.get actually returns a response and an error, so we'll just cache the response, and if error not equal to nil, we'll panic with this error. For the purpose of demo, we'll panic, but try not to panic, and just defer response.body.close. We need to close the response body, and we'll do io.copy, so we'll copy it to. So this io.copy actually takes a writer and then the reader. So writer is where do we want to write this to, so we'll write it to std out, which is the standard output, and read it from response.body. Okay, let's try to run this from. So server, I'll run main.go, it will start the server. I'll go to client, and then I'll do go run main.go. It will send the http request and response will be hello. Okay, so now we have a client server connection set up. Now we need to introduce the context into it. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll set a timeout for this request. So we'll say after 1 second, if it takes more than 1 second, then timeout this request. So let's do that. So the first thing that we need to do is make a context as always. So I'll do context dot with timeout, and the parent context, which will be context dot background. So this will be our parent context, and timeout I'll set it to 1 second. Okay, and we'll have a cancel function here, and let's close this. Let's just defer this cancel. Okay, and now we need to make a new request. So if you want to attach a context to this request, then we need to make the request. So we'll use http dot new request with context. So we'll pass this context, and I'll do http dot method get. So this is the method that we want, and next parameter would be the URL, which will be http localhost 3000, and last parameter will be nil, which will be the body. I don't want any body. So this will give us a request and error. I'll check for error just like this, and now that I have the request, I can, instead of doing this, I can do http dot default client dot do request. So again, this will return a response and error, and if error not equals to nil, we'll panic and close the response body and copy it to standard output. Copy the response back to standard output. Okay, let me remove this. Okay, so now we have a context in this http request, and this context has a timeout set, which will be 1 second. So if it takes more than 1 second, then it will time out the request. Now we need to receive that request in our server. So what do we do? So we can actually find the context here. So where do we find the context? We have this request.context right here. So I have the context here. Now what I'll need to do is I'll simulate sort of the same timeout approach that we simulated before. So we'll start with the select statement, and I'll add a case that okay, time dot after. So after 2 seconds, I want this to happen. Okay, after 2 seconds, give the response back to the client with hello. And if actually the context times out, the request times out, so we'll catch it through context.done as we have done before, and we'll do we'll do actually log dot println and context dot error, and also we'll send http dot error back. http dot error will take the writer and it will take the error context dot error, and http dot status, uh, we'll just send internal server error for now. So now we have a handler which actually responds after 2 seconds, and it also catches our timeout. So let's run this and see what happens. So we'll do run main.go in the server, and in the client we'll run go run main.go, and the client should actually panic because context deadline has exceeded. So that's what we expected. It actually timed out after 1 second because our timeout has been set to 1 second here, and it took too long to respond from here. Now let's see what happens if I sleep for some arbitrary time which is less than a second. Surely if you understand how this works, then you know it will not get timed down, it will actually print hello. But let's try that. So I'll just do maybe 500 time dot millisecond, and if I run this, so the server is running, and if I do go run main.go, then it should actually print hello. So it's successfully printed. So that's how you can send your context across HTTP requests. So now let's talk about the only remaining item in the list, which is context.withValue. So as we have discussed before, context.withValue you'll generally use when you want to send request scope values across the HTTP requests. So one example which makes sense here would be to send a request ID and attaching it to the context. So this will help keep track of our requests. So this is an example which I'm going to borrow from Francis Campoy. He has an amazing YouTube channel and a very good video regarding this. So I just like the example that he took, and I'm going to explain you with the same example. So we are going to make a sort of logger. So whenever we try to print something, we'll attach a request ID to it so we can map the request to the log itself. Okay, so we'll make a new directory which is logger, and make a new file logger.go. Package will be logger, and we'll just use this function println. So this function will take in the context, which is context.context, and it will take the message. So we are actually mapping the log with the request ID itself. So request ID will actually sit in our context. So we'll set this later, but now let's just try to print it. So how we get the value from context is context.value. So we have discussed this before. This context interface has a value function attached to it. So we'll use that value function to get the value. Okay, so the key we need to put, the key will be request ID, and this key I'll convert into typecast into int64. So this value will be v, and it is possible that this value is not really set at that point of time, so we'll catch it with okay. So if not okay, what happened? If not okay, we'll just print request ID not found. Okay, and we'll also return it since we cannot do anything here now. Okay, so if we find it, we'll just do log dot println, and I'll print the request ID here, and I'll print the message here. So request ID will be your v, and the message will be the incoming message. Okay, so now that we have this println function, so what basically we'll need to do is every time we receive a request in handler, we need to make a request ID and then set the value of that request ID in the context dot value. So I cannot expect the user to every time, the developer actually to every time call a function to set this context, which is context dot with value here. So this sounds like something we can achieve in a much better way. So what we'll do is we'll make a decorator here. So we'll go to logger and we'll make a decorator here which will be decorate, and it takes http dot handler func, and it will return http dot handler func. It will just decorate this handler func and return it back. So I'll return a function, and handler func is basically it takes response writer and it takes pointer to the request. So now I need to send the request id. So this request id will be random int63 number, and now we have the request id and we have context which we get from request.context. So we have discussed this before, we can get it from request.context. Now I need to add a value context to it. So what I'll do is we'll make context dot with value, and it will take the pre-int context and it will take the key will be request id, and the value will be your request id value which we just got. Okay, remove this. Okay, the context is set. Now all I need to do is call this function with writer, and the request will be request dot with context, and this is the context that we are attaching to it. Okay, does not seem happy, should not use basic tag. Okay, so this is just a warning. For now we can ignore it. So we have a decorate function which will actually take our handler, and in this handler it will attach this new context with value to this request. Okay, now let's use this handler actually. So in this handler, instead of calling handler directory, we'll do logger dot decorate. So decorate this handler, and whenever we want to print, I can just do logger dot println. It will take the context. So this context will be the context and context dot error. Okay, let's run it again. Let's run the server and let's run the client now. Okay, it's not supposed to timeout right now, so we'll just change it back to 2 seconds so that it times out. Okay, so let's run the server and we'll run the client as well. And if you see, it panicked as we expected and context deadline exceeded, but here you can see that it printed request id and it says context cancelled. So that is actually what we wanted. Some formatting issue is there, I think. Okay, that's my bad. So let me run this again just to print the output properly. And what the hell? Oh, okay, so this is actually an integer in 64. So let's clear this. Okay, so now it printed properly. So this is a request id and it says context cancel. So basically what we have done is we attached a value to this context and then received the value with dot value here. So this is all there is uh, to the context package. So we have covered all the 4 things, all the 6 things actually. So our background, our to do, and with timeout, with deadline, and with cancel, and now with value. So this is all I have for you today. So if you like this video, then please hit the like button and maybe subscribe to my channel, and we'll come up with more interesting videos moving forward. Thank you.